warm welcome to Dr. Melissa Vang. It's a great honor to feature you in this cross-cultural webinar, and we're going to go ahead and have a more formal introduction on who Dr. Melissa Vang is. But before we get started, welcome to the Cross-Cultural Center at San Diego State University, Imperial Valley. The Cross-Cultural Center at SDSU Imperial Valley is dedicated to creating an inclusive campus environment for all our students. And part of creating an inclusive campus environment is representation. And part of that representation is Empoderación en Educación, where we're dedicated to creating events parallel to our Heritage Months, where we have scholars, organizers, authors, artists who are at the forefront at the social justice of our diverse student communities. So what diversity means is that we creating an inclusive environment for all students and taking into consideration the intersections of their social identities. So for that, with Empoderación en Educación, with our Heritage Months, we celebrate Women's History Month, we celebrate Black History Month, and in May is our Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Although May can be a very busy schedule with our events for commencement, we do want to dedicate the space in April to celebrate our Asian Pacific Islander and most specifically also Asian to Southeast Asian scholars and organizers and overall students. So that is what this session is dedicated to creating that inclusive environment through those Heritage Months. These events are in collaboration with our student leaders from the Empoderación en Educación project and our graduate assistant, and not just for the Cross-Cultural Center, but also for the Division of Student Affairs is with us in the watch party and LA1, co-leading this event with me. Christy, would you like to share a little bit about your experience in Empoderación before we get started?
Hello, hi, thank you for being here. I'm sorry, I tried to zoom into myself, but I'm a little bit far. Are you able to hear me okay? Okay, great, perfect. So it's an honor to be here. Like Dr. Falcon mentioned, my name is Christy Jimenez. I am the graduate assistant for the Cross-Cultural Center and also for Student Affairs. I will be, here in the chat, just checking Q&A in the chat and also interacting here with our in-person audience. So like Dr. Falcon mentioned, I am also one of the student leaders for Empoderación en Educación, and it has been a really amazing project highlighting underrepresented success stories within higher education, and of course in parallel of celebrating the Heritage Months within the whole year. So it's an honor to be here today, and pleasure, and thank you for being here today too.
Thank you, Christy. So with no further ado, we would like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Melissa Vang. Dr. Melissa Vang is a DEI scholar, practitioner, and strategist dedicated to organizational development and effectiveness. She's earned her doctorate in education with an emphasis in DEI, especially racial equity from San Diego State University and Claremont Graduate University. Her recent research examined the influence of organizational climate on the ethnic and racial identity of Hmong American students using visual methods. She is a recipient of the California State University Chancellor's Doctoral Initiative Program and recipient of the Asian American Native American Pacific Islander Serving Institution Research Grant from the Department of Education, and recognized for her work in advancing the equitable practices for organizational transformation from San Diego State University. And that is just a little bit of Dr. Melissa Vang. Overall, I have had the great pleasure of working with Dr. Vang, and I call her my academic sister, but anything that I can do, Dr. Melissa Vang can do better. She is a scholar in quantitative methods, qualitative methods, visual methodologies, and a leading scholar in her field. So that is just to say the least. But now, with no further ado, I want to open up the floor to Dr. Vang.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Dr. Falcon, for such an amazing and nice and warm introduction. I feel like she over exaggerated because I feel like it honestly goes both ways. I think she's my academic sister, and today we're going to talk about identity. And I was so fortunate to be paired with Dr. Fogel about identity because she also does work in identity. So that further just deepened my knowledge and expertise in identity, which I'm so excited to share with you all. But first, I want to say thank you, Dr. Falcon and San Diego State University and Pearl Valley's Cross-Cultural Center for this great opportunity. I feel like we don't talk about identity enough, and also it's hard for colleges to put identity into practice. So I think this conversation, I hope whichever role you're in, also you personally could also start to think about how your identities impact you and just how other external entities influence that your identity. So while I'm focused on Hmong American, please also see how any of this information could be related to you and your personal settings and identities as well. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Okay, so today my presentation will be focused on understanding the ethnic and racial identity of Hmong American students in higher education. Today is a condensed version of my latest research, so if it feels kind of fast, that is because it is. And so I hope that we can engage in a deeper conversation afterwards. So just a little session outline. I'm going to begin with my positionality and just this ongoing reflection process that Dr. Falcon asked me to kind of story tell, and then go into the research itself. And then what does it look like to be research into practice, right? Which is a little different than if I continue to be a researcher or a faculty member. And so before I get started, I wanted to just kind of provide us with some terms that I'll be using in this session. I'll be using ethnic identity, racial identity, and racialization a lot throughout the presentation. So when I refer to ethnic identity, it's someone's sense of self as part of a member of an ethnic group, and also the association of those behaviors and also cultural practices of that group. Racial identity is ascribed to membership of a racial category, and also along with all the racial stereotypes associated with that a specific identity. Also to acknowledge that race and racial identity are socially constructed. And so when I talk about racialization, it's the process of applying all of those stereotypes and those associations to certain individuals without understanding those individuals' actual identities. And so first, I start off with my positionality. So I truly believe that it's really important to understand how you show up in spaces, but also how others perceive you when you do show up, because there might be, it might not align, right? And so because there are certain times where you may feel lost, uncertain, also this concept that higher ed loves to use, this sense of belonging where you feel you don't belong, it's really because of these spaces and external factors that impact who you are as a person and your identities. So positionality is always a great way to remind you who you are as you continue to work towards your goals personally or professionally. For me, my dominant identity has always been Hmong American. But because Hmong American identity is a marginal or a minoritized identity within a minoritized group, a lot of folks don't understand where that situates within this racial hierarchy. And so they'll always want to correct me and say, oh, you're Asian. And I always reply with, well, I'm Hmong American before I'm Asian American, but I understand where the concept or the identity of Asian American comes from. And so with my Hmong American identity, I am such a proud daughter of Hmong refugees who resiliently persevered through being exiled from China to the mountaintops of Laos, to surviving the Vietnam War, seeking refuge in Thailand, and coming to the US at the age of like 10 and 12 to really just see what is out there for a better life. And I say that all together to say that for my next identity, I am so privileged to say here, or to be here and say that I'm also a second college generation student. And this identity has not always been salient because it's been received very negatively. The assumption that if you're a second generation, that you know everything, you don't need help, you have it easy, which I think are all assumptions, because when you look at it intersectionally, you look at the complexities of how I became a second generation college student. And I think that also takes away from my dad's struggles of, coming here to the US, learning English and earning a terminal degree, which he's lived through things that I could never have ever survived. So that has taken on a new light in itself. But understanding that all of my experience have been racialized through this dominant lens of Asian American. And no matter where I show up first, I will always be perceived as Asian American, and female. And so I share these identities to say that my last identity that I share as a researcher has really provided me the critical lens to really understand how to respond to spaces, how to navigate spaces that are not inclusive. And so that has been the core of how I navigated my way and in my identities through different spaces in higher education. And so just kind of like, how did all of this come together, right? What is the ongoing reflection process? And I'll say that I could sit here and discuss my identities today, but I was not able to do that before my doctoral program. I think it's a lot of ongoing, it's an ongoing journey through research, reading existing research, challenging research that write about you and your community, and also having personal reflections and discussions with colleagues who you feel are supportive and who can have healthy conversations about identity. And so as we interact with people and even with the media through our entire lives, we have to think of what has been exposed and done to us to make us reflect and think about our identities in a negative or a positive way. And so I'll be sharing just a few examples of just moments I've had in my life that I still think about that impacted my identity as Hmong American. And so the first memory I want to share, I call this pizza for breakfast. And so I was in elementary grade school, and a classmate asked me, what did I have for breakfast as we we're waiting for the gates to open? I said, oh, I had pizza. It was delicious. And she said, pizza? Why would you want pizza for breakfast? You're not supposed to eat that. And I thought that, oh, Hmong people, I was like, we don't know how to eat breakfast correctly. Oh my gosh. And that was like the last time I ever mentioned to anyone I had pizza for breakfast, but I still did it. I just never shared it with anyone. And so I still reflect on that till this day. And I think about my parents and how they refuged here, and thinking about that for them, it wasn't the American breakfast, you only eat specific things. For them, it was more like you need to be full enough to do good in school and at least reach lunchtime, right? And so I was like, yeah, so kind of like just going against this, what is the American way, which I'm really grateful for. And then the next one is in grade school, someone told me that my favorite color was yellow and that my skin was yellow. And I was so confused, and I replied with yellow is not my favorite color. And today, the impact of it is that yellow is still not my favorite color. And so, and then I was so confused as to why my skin was yellow. And so reflecting on it, and like as I got older, that memory still stuck with me. And so knowing that that classmate probably had access to information or media of some sort that, kind of portrayed Asians as yellow, or their favorite color as yellow, or the yellow peril. And so all of these things really contribute to how folks and other people make us feel in our own identities. I think the last example I'll share is that as a doctoral student, we are encouraged to apply to associations to support our research. And so I did, but then I wanted to focus on Southeast Asian students and not just Asian American students, because there's a big difference. And so the association said, please give us a call if you have, any trouble or have any discrepancies in your application. So I called, and the gentleman on the other line said, how can I help you? And I said, well, I would like for my title and my category to be specifically under Southeast Asian. He immediately replied with, oh, you mean Asian American? And I said, no. So I did not submit my proposal because I knew that if they did not know what it was, the chances of it being funded was extremely low. And so those are just moments where they stay with me forever. They impact my identities as Hmong Southeast Asian. And so I think it's interesting just how society responds and what they do to us to really make us question our own identities. And so it wasn't until my master's program that I started to get kind of introductions to what is identity, right? What is racial ethnic identity? And so, but that if you think about it, that's actually a very long time to even start thinking about your identity. I honestly think that it should come sooner, right? And so in my joint doctoral program, I would say that they provided not only resources, but I was able to connect all the micro, macro, exo interactions and also all the doings that were done onto me to make me question my identity, but also what I've done to others that may have made them question their identity, right? Not being able to have like that healthy, organic conversation about identity. And so taking it deeper, I was able to apply any identity into any systemic and historical lens. And in order to connect it all, because it starts from somewhere, and then the way that it evolves also has an impact on what it is today, just like race. And so because my work is focused in identity, my approach to diversity, equity, inclusion is more intentional, more collaborative, and more strategic. And one of my favorite scholars, Jason Chan, he writes about identity and he talks about these points of access. He talks about students who come into any college campus have different points of access and awareness of their own self-consciousness in terms of their identities. And that it's the institution's responsibility to really meet them where they are when they enter. And so for me, this was just everywhere. I really had to embrace the process of unlearning, acknowledging, connecting the doings, and also once you're able to put language onto what you're experiencing or what others have done to you, the reflection going forward is only progressive, right? And you become, I feel like, a better version of yourself and how you engage with others who have similar identities, but also have different identities than you do. And so I've also recognized that it's not only resources, it must be resources plus conversations and opportunities to express your identity, because a lot of times identities are internalized, right? And so the more students get the opportunity to express their identities, I think it will be a better, it'll build for better conversations around identity and race in general. And so bringing in all my identities and injecting these into our world and how it operates is truly an ongoing process, and also is the reason how I kind of gravitated towards identity research. And so this is why I center my research on identity, because I understand how important it is and how easily it could be lost, misinformed, disregarded, or negatively impacted. And so first, I would like to begin with my conceptual framework. It might feel like a lot, but I will explain it to you. So I'm sharing this early on. Usually the conceptual framework comes later, but I think to set kind of like the research and the direction of this conversation, I wanted to put this at the forefront, right? And so I thought that one theory or one conceptual framework was not enough to encompass this whole identity, this concept of identity, right? If it's race, ethnic, a sexual orientation identity, just identity in general. And so the first one we see are all the circles. This is the ecological theory in human development by Brock and Bernard. And this theory was created actually for child development, where the scholar puts the child at the center and shows us that all these different external systems impacts how a person develops. I completely agree, but I feel like the one caveat with this is that it's race neutral. It doesn't talk about the impact of race or ethnic or identity. It talks about one aspect of human development. And so I went and I wanted to look for something that was very race and ethnicity specific. And so in their book, Marcus and Moya talk about race and ethnicities. And to me, they're the first scholars to talk about race and ethnicities as doings, things that are done to us to make us feel a certain way about our ethnic and racial identity or how we perceive race. And so in terms of identity development, that makes complete sense, right? Just like the stories I shared, the reactions that I got, made me think that my identity didn't belong here, right? It was kind of misplaced. And so those two together, I feel like we're able to capture more of the direction I wanted to go. But like Dr. Falcone said, intersectionality is so important. We are just not one identity, we are multiple identities. And so I included Crenshaw's intersectionality. She does talk about gender and race, which are two identities. And so when we just combine, intersect more than one identities, it's a completely different narrative, completely different experiences, right? The thing that Crenshaw also talks about are these political, representational, and structural identity, which I believe is very applicable to higher education. In terms of policies, what kind of policies are we making? Who are we, which students are we excluding? And so together I created this conceptual framework, and I just felt that it really captured this idea of what impacts our identity development specifically for ethnic and racial, and specifically for this study for Hmong American students. And so with that, I hope that you also think about how have others made you feel about a certain identity you have from their actions? How did that in return make you feel? And this is also very applicable to higher education as we talk about race and ethnicity and how we support students. And so just a little history or a literature review of higher education. Of course, the foundation of higher education was built through the trade and labor of enslaved African Americans and Native Americans. So when we think of Ivy Leagues or higher education in general, it was made by who and it was made for who. Those are very different questions and are very critical, right, to distinguish between the two. Higher education was a luxury for many and only accessible by white elite upper class men. So as the shift in the United States demographics started, of course, the demand for equal rights and access and opportunity to attend college also increased. And so with this shift from just being white elite upperclassmen to more diverse Black, Latinx students and Asian American students, of course, there's like this creation of what is diversity? Diversity started off with multiculturalism. Diversity started off with, a quota. But then researchers have argued that diversity actually provides students with more benefits than what folks actually believe diversity to be. And so there are a lot of diversity efforts. However, as you will see later, that diversity sometimes miss its mark. And so why the push for equal access and opportunity to attend college by other communities, right? Because research has shown that if you obtain a college degree, you do have a tool for social mobility. And also this is possibly an increased factor for for one's quality of life. So a lot of benefits, or a few benefits, and of course, who wouldn't want to take advantage of this? And so as we have this like structured and historical lens of higher education, once we bring Hmong Americans into this narrative, the resettlement and the history of the Hmongs coming to the United States in the mid-1970s, right? Towards, in between like the civil rights era social reform movement. And by then we already had Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans in the US. And so of course the racialization begins right when they arrive, but there's a disadvantage already. But the Hmongs were economically, socially, linguistically disadvantaged, right? So in order to really, when we talk about equity, that is an equity issue. And today it still stands as it is. And so Hmong Americans continue to be underrepresented in higher education due to this racialization factor. Some data show that only 14% of Hmong Americans hold a bachelor's degree over the age of 25 compared to the national average. And the last point, number 5, is that there's a high percentage, 47.5%, among students who enter college do not complete their educational goal. So they withdraw for non-academic reasons. And so we're talking about higher education, a very white space that was created for white men. This idea of the complexity of racial and ethnic identity. So specifically for this study, when we talk about Asian identity, which is a racial, and Hmong, which is the ethnic, it's very polar opposites, right? Because Asian American, you have these stereotypes, negative, positive, the model minority, right? That they thrive in these certain categories, that they're honorary whites. But then we have the ethnic identity, Hmong Americans, even Southeast Asian, who are perceived as deviants, troublemakers, gangsters. And so these are absolutely bipolar identities that are kind of in our stereotypical narrative right now. And so where do Hmong Americans, how do they like feel or fit into that? And so even Winkle, Wagner, and Locke say that identity is an undervalued component to diversity efforts. And then Vu states clearly, and I completely agree, that students' race and or identity are used most often as categorical reasons, such as data. So if we look at just any college or university, the only time that they're comfortable talking about Black, Latinx, Asian, Filipino, Native Pacific Islander is when it's about data, mainly graduation rates, right? Transfer rates. And so when we utilize identities in that way, we're not really talking about identity. We're just using identities as an outcome. And so even Tierney, who is really well known in the scholar world in higher education, he said that identity is central to the success, and that it's the responsibilities of institutions to really look at their structures and culture to really see how they could adjust their own practices to affirm students' identities. And these are just a few scholars, but there are other scholars who advocated that identity is really critical. Dr. Gina Garcia is advocating that it should be an outcome for colleges and universities to really look to, and how do they measure that? And so even with my review of identity in higher education and experience in higher education, there is truly a lack of opportunity to discuss and understand identity, both as an individual and also discussing that in relation to your colleagues and your peers. And also, how do you use your identities that are privileged to really support other communities, right? And so the purpose of this study is to really examine the ethnic and racial identity of Hmong American undergraduate students at a four-year university in California. The methodology is a qualitative, specifically it's a phenomenological study. It focuses on, of course, the ethnic and racial identity. And the setting is at a four-year university in California, which serves at the time about 13% Asian. And of that 13%, 44% identify as Hmong. So this university has a very high population of Hmong students. And so it was very interesting to see just how they perceive the campus itself. Of course, recruitment was completed through snowball and purposeful sampling. The data collection component was very intentional, challenging traditional research instead of a one-time engagement. I wanted to be intentional in being initial interview, which getting to build a rapport with students, and also learning more about the history, engaging them, inviting them to do a visual activity, and also concluding the interview to talk about the process and talk about just their reflection through the interview process. So the criteria was that they had to be at least 18 years old, identify as Hmong or Hmong American, and completed at least one academic year at the selected university. And so if it's 10 students, about 20 interviews in total. There are 7 females and 2 males. They range between the ages of 18 to 28. 6 identify as first generation college students. 4 identify as second generation college students. And then 4 indicated aspiring to earn a doctorate or a different terminal degree. 3 aspired to earn a master's, and then 3 aspired for a baccalaureate degree. 9 grew up in the local area, and 7 indicated having taken or currently taking an ethnic studies course. And I just wanted to kind of assess to see if they did take it, because we all know ethnic studies is so important to students' development, and those who take it absolutely see themselves in the literature. 6 of the 7 took Asian American studies, and 1 took African American studies. And so after analysis for this presentation, I wanted to share just 3 findings with you all. The first one is just the racialized experiences from K through 12 and transition into higher education. And then discussion of what the good identity is, which is the Asian American identity, and also the double-edged identity, which is the Hmong American identity. And as the title says, to understand. It's as a researcher to understand from the student perspective how they experience the college campus, and also how they understand their own ethnic and racial identity. But their practice component is all placed on the institution. And it is their responsibility to really see where the gaps are, to see where they can support students better in terms of their development. And so the first one, racialized experiences from K to 12 and transition into higher education. This was part of the protocol, which I wanted to be very intentional, because I didn't want just to interview students' experiences in higher education, because identity starts right when you're born. And so we carry out our identities throughout our entire lives. The ones that we are kind of like born into, but also the ones that we, the new ones that we like get, right? So for example, when I finished my bachelor, my new identity is now, Dr. Melissa Vang, which is a new identity. Being married is a new identity. And so there are just a lot of identities that we do have throughout life. And so having these conversations with these students, the ways that race and ethnicity were communicated to students really influenced how they felt about their identity. And it was mainly about their Hmong identity. They were often compared to East Asians, like we mentioned, Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. And when moments like that happened, there were moments of displacement of their Hmong identity in these educational settings. And then, of course, constantly just defending their Hmong identity. And so one student shared that, I will usually get bullied with a ching chong and like, oh, look at my eyes and what are you wearing? It was a lot of pressure that made me feel like, do I really belong here? Does it really matter if I even go anywhere at all? So institutions really do want to focus on sense of belonging. And so this is an aspect of what it feels like to not belong, right? These are the interactions that make us feel like we don't belong in a certain space. Another one, talking about her transition from elementary to middle school, said that middle school felt the same as elementary. I still felt that I didn't have much Hmong peers. That's why I struggled in middle school and struggled the most with my Hmong identity. I kind of felt like I lost a lot of myself, and that's why I wanted to fully assimilate. And that's when my school affected me, how I personally felt about my Hmong culture. And so sometimes there will be places where Hmong presence is not dominant, or there aren't a lot of Hmong peers around. But then just the feeling that there was nowhere to turn to, no conversations, just no acknowledgement of students' identities, making students feel like they have to assimilate, or the sense of belonging just continues to wither away. And so this is the transition from like elementary to middle school. And so as we get into higher ed, does it stop, right? Because understanding that K through 12 is a different environment, but then when we get to higher ed, it's the way that the racialization takes place or form is just in a different way. And so Paul shared that there's a couple of times people randomly walking up to me to ask, oh my gosh, are you a foreign exchange student or something? And then, of course, on college campuses, we do have international students, but we also have students who are not international. And then the assumption that international students are only Asian is also something that's an issue. Nick shared that a white student asked me, oh, is that a gold cuff? Are you like one of those crazy rich Asians? And this is just right when the movie Crazy Rich Asians came out. And then the socioeconomic discrepancy between the Asian American ethnic groups is so wide. And of course, Nick shared that she took offense and then she just gathered her stuff and left. And so the way that racialization plays out in K-12 and higher education is just the entire life trajectory of this idea that your Hmong identity is not in the picture at all. And so it was interesting asking students explicitly, just what does it mean to be Asian American? And so it was a lot of students, when we talked about their Asian American identity, used words as good or nice to describe the Asian American experience and identity. And the quotes following this slide will demonstrate how and why. And so oftentimes it's referred to as being Asian descent or being part of a pan-ethnic identity. And so here C said, I think being Asian American to me means supporting other Asians, because I think it's very important that in a way we're all still minorities in this world. We just all need to stand together and be like in a huge support group for one another. Because there are times in the past that we didn't have people who stood by us and were here to help protect us. And we should all be there for each other. And I think it's being called an Asian American. It kind of ties us to get in and makes us stronger. And so the idea of Asian American is, this like unity, this pan-ethnic, just solidarity to really help each other, right? And also bring in historical context of just when our racial segregation was at its peak, right? And so another example, Hero, actually took a different standpoint, which he said, it really depends. Like if I go to an area where they have no idea who Hmong people are, I'll just say I'm Asian. If they're curious to know, I'll specify, oh, sorry, but here I must say Hmong, like Hmong, oh, okay, that's cool. Instead of having like, are you Mongolian? Like, no, I'm not. Okay. It saves me that. If I really don't want to talk to them, I'll just say I'm Asian. Are you from China? Yes. And so Hero demonstrated how he navigates his identity between Asian and Hmong, right? And so I think for him, it just saves him more time rather than just going to this constant conversation, a deeper conversation about what is Hmong. And so when we transitioned from the Asian American identity, which had more positive reactions than when we did about the Hmong American identity, it was very interesting. And so for the Hmong identity, one participant or student shared that it feels like a double-edged identity. And so that's where I got the title from. And so Hmong identity was not often referred to when we talked about college or college experience. Hmong identity was indeed more salient, like they felt more connected to their Hmong identity than their Asian, but not when discussing college. Hmong identity was more connected to the Hmong culture and acknowledgement of their Hmong history. And so challenges of being Hmong and American were more salient in this discussion. And it felt so separated when we're talking about the context of higher education. And it also felt like students carried this burden of trying to navigate all of these different spaces with their Hmong identity. And so Chris shared, like, what does it mean to be Hmong? I feel like it's a double-edged sword. That's what I feel like what it means to be Hmong. It's like a double-edged sword where you want to pursue a life, but you can't forget your past and your culture too. It's kind of like, sometimes you get lost within that, and sometimes you're just too American, then not too Hmong. And so we kind of see like the struggle between the words Hmong American. What does it mean? How do we navigate that? Because higher education is a very American thing to do, right? And so Ju also shared that to be Hmong is to have it in your flesh and blood. I'm going to be honest though, the Hmong culture is not perfect. It's sexist and there's a double standard, but it's what we are. Last year I was struggling over, is it okay to be Hmong or am I American? Am I going to be the good Hmong daughter that goes home after school and cleans and cooks and provides for my family? Or am I going to be the selfish American girl that puts her studies before cleaning and cooking for her parents and be a good nya, which is a daughter-in-law? And so we see the struggle here that, and not just race and ethnicity, we're throwing gender into this too. And so the double edge is this kind of depicting between different cultures, different spaces, but also a sense of not talking about it, which is the responsibility of the institution to provide that, especially if the institution has 44% of its Asian students who identify as Hmong. And so implications for practice. All implications, I believe, should be for institutions to provide to students, not for students to do. And so intentional resources to explore and understand ethnic and racial identity, and not just a one-time kind of workshop, but an ongoing process and resource for students to really rely on, and to have open conversations, to have these discussions, but also be progressive in the work on how do we build on that? And how do we heal from any trauma that we experience from our own culture or external cultures? Institutional responsibility to foster development, as Tierney and other scholars have said, and also being innovative and creating new outcomes. For example, critical conscious development outcome, and not to be confused by critical thinking, which are completely different. Professional development for faculty and campus staff to create more inclusive curriculum, how to engage with students, and more intentional DEI efforts. Which means that, as Vincent shares, if we want to talk about equity, we really need to be race conscious in our efforts and really look at those measurements and those outcomes and identify the gaps. When colleges and universities refer to Asian students, how is this being done? How is it being communicated? Are we just talking about Asians in the aggregate, or are we talking about disaggregated based on our student population, which a lot of scholars have advocated for if your school or a college has a high percentage of Asian students, and what does that look like? So I'm gonna stop there because I think we might be at time. But I want to say thank you for listening to that presentation of my research and my passion for identity. So Dr. Falcon, I'll pass it over to you.
Yes, I just want to invite the audience to provide a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much for such a brilliant presentation, important and really groundbreaking in the need to disaggregate, to really disaggregate who we have a lot of these pan-ethnic identities that you know, they're we see them in the questionnaires, the surveys, but the reality is that we have so much diversity, cultural, linguistically, of course, ethnically. And here in this session is just one example of that. So I just want to firstly congratulate you on this amazing work, and invite our audience to provide a round of applause before we dive into questions and answers.
Yes, while we wait for questions, more, I guess, insights I would like to share, right? Colleges and universities, they currently operationalize in a very singular way. It's if you're Black, you're Black. If you're Latinx, you're Latinx. We have not figured out a way to look at multiracial, ethnic, and cultural students yet. So that's something hopefully in the future we could really encompass. Because, for example, when we talk about, oh, Asian students, what about Asians who are multiracial, right? We don't include them in that conversation.
Absolutely. And which is why your work is so important. And I can't help it but just feel chills when you read the quotes, specifically also the importance of seeing students seeing themselves represented or seeing themselves in the literature and what that means. I do have a few questions, but before I ask my questions, I do want to open up the floor to our audience. You're more than welcome to ask your questions by typing your questions in the chat box. If you're shy, you can type your questions in the chat box, but if you're not too shy, you are more than welcome to unmute yourself and turn on your camera and ask your question that way.
Hello, I just want to say that your presentation was amazing, Dr. Bang. And as a Master's of Social Work student, I really was interested in the frameworks that, you were working under, or that you kind of like created, like the mixture. I really liked that you included intersectionality and then also the ecological theory, which I've seen time and time again in social work. So I think that's, I hadn't looked at it critically in that way, that it didn't have the race aspect included on there. So I thought that observation and work that you're doing is absolutely amazing, and something that we need to think more of as students and also professionals within higher ed. So I just wanted to also mention another quote that I really liked, was that it's important for higher education professionals, or just anyone working in a college or university, to have conversations and not just provide the resources. That really stood out to me because I think that time and time again, we provide those resources or we tell people, but in reality, it's kind of like, I don't know how to describe it, like blurred in the background, and the conversations are what really like hook people or hook students into feeling included. So my question to you is, how can we as like peers or allies, or even higher education professionals begin this conversation with Hmong students, or any maybe identity, maybe indigenous student that they might be not feel included. How can we start these conversations with students?
Yeah, great question. I think it depends on your role on campus, right? Because I think if you engage with students a lot, that conversation is easier to have than like in my positions where I'm a data analyst. I don't get to engage with students a lot, but I do engage with focus groups with students. It's a simple, honestly, I think sometimes higher education make things harder for themselves, but it's really asking, like how, just asking like, how are you doing? What is your experience at this college or in this program? What can we do to make it better? Like, do you feel like, your identity is represented, or what is your identity? What is your ethnic background? And so having these, and then giving students the opportunity just to say it back, you might be surprised that it might be the first time they actually get to express it to someone working at the campus, because we might assume that this might be a normal conversation when really it's not. And so sometimes, like you said, we want to do program, right? And programming is so different than having just general, authentic conversations with folks, to share out like, these are my identity. And also pushing, like, if you, for example, in informal spaces are when you get to share out the most. And so, for example, if I had a colleague who identifies as Hmong, but when we share out, that colleague did not mention that they're Hmong, I would ask them, hey, like, I noticed that you didn't mention your Hmong identity. Can I ask why? Because that happened a lot, and then they had to think about it themselves, right? So I think being a good colleague and also encouraging folks to really share out their identities that they've shared maybe personally with you is also really, really a good opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for those insights. And for our audience, you're more than welcome to post your questions in the chat box, or simply unmute yourself. You can turn on your camera or not, and you can ask your questions that way. And while the audience posts their question, I have a follow-up question kind of built on this question. And it's on the topic of representation. Representation matters, which is why it's so important to have events like these, and why it's so important to have scholarship, have literature that is included in the syllabus, that or syllabi of our campuses. And on that note, the reality is that many times we don't have those inclusive spaces, or those spaces that are specific for the intersections of social identities, or even more specifically for Hmong students. So for your focus groups in your research, were there ever times where students have shared, I've never been asked this question, or this is the first time I have the opportunity to reflect on my identity? What has been your experience in that?
Yes, absolutely, Dr. Falcone. All of my participants, because you never know if participants or students are going to come back for that second interview, but they all came back because they were also invested in the process for themselves and for the research. And I would say the majority of them said that no one's ever asked them these questions. They never had a chance to reflect on this process or these experiences outside of the classroom. Because technically, when I engaged with them, it was outside the classroom. And so this is a different type of engagement for them at the college. And I also have the interviews at the college so that, it's their familiar setting. It's nowhere out of their, just their everyday, I guess, environment. And so I was surprised that a majority of them shared that this was the first time that anyone's engaged them intentionally, like the way I did. So that also speaks to how do we intentionally engage and have these ongoing process. And a lot of times I was asking them like, how did it make you feel? And so I think those are questions that don't often get asked in higher ed because like we said, it's programming, it's getting this done, it's graduating. And in between all that, we don't have time to reflect, stop, and just think about our identities.
Absolutely. And so we are almost out of time. So I do want to welcome the audience. If you have one last question that you want to ask, you're more than welcome to type this question in the chat box, or again, just simply unmute yourself and ask your question that way. And while if anybody has a last question and you're kind of getting your thoughts together and typing it here in the chat box, I do want to emphasize the importance of including literature about our diverse communities in your syllabus, in your syllabi, or overall, whether it be programming, and continuing to develop your cultural competency, cultural humility. And specifically, if you want to learn more about Hmong students in higher education and you want to learn more about Dr. Vang's work, you can simply do a Google Scholar search with Melissa Vang, and you'll see her publications there. However, I will also be more than happy to share with you articles. And Dr. Vang, if you have, I know you have studies, if you have maybe particular studies that you wish the audience can learn about, send them my way, and I would be very, very happy to email them these publications along with the recording of this session. But if you can't wait, please go ahead and do that Google Scholar search, and you'll find the literature there. But we are out of time. And so if you have any last questions, this is definitely the time to ask. But if you're shy and maybe you don't want to ask your questions in this space, send any questions that you have my way, and I'll be happy to relay those questions to Dr. Vang. But now we are at a time. We want to be mindful of Dr. Vang's schedule and on time. So but before we end, we have a concluding question. We often ask this question in closing, and I know you're going to be very familiar with this question. We've used it ourselves in our work, but our concluding question is, if you could give one piece of advice to whether it be a younger self or a younger Hmong student, perhaps, whether it be in undergraduate or graduate studies, that hopes to embark in similar work that you're doing, or simply wants to be able to create an inclusive space for their community, what piece of advice would you tell them?
Ooh, that's a good one. I would say, as simple as it sounds, but I know it's harder to do, is just don't give up. There are a lot of external factors that will tell you that you're not enough or that, you can't do it. But I say, yeah, just don't give up. Another advice is that create your community. Create your community that will support you, that will love you unconditionally, intellectually, and, as a human being.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for those closing remarks. This is the end of our session. Is there anything else that you want to share that maybe you didn't get a chance to share?
It's just so much to talk about the identity. And I hope that, I think majority of us are working at institutions to really think about just how identity is communicated and used and be innovative. Don't be scared. I know that we're going against the grain, but sometimes I think it needs to happen.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your work, your brilliance, and overall just talent and scholarship in this field. It really is transformational. Really, I mean, if you really do that Google Scholar search, and I'm saying it for everybody, you'll see Dr. Bang being the leading scholar in this work, which makes a difference because it makes a world of a difference for students, for people to be able to follow the leadership and do the work or learn, but also for students to see themselves represented. So I just want to say once again, thank you so much. And with this thank you, we end today's session, and we will continue to be in community and in solidarity.
Yes, thank you so much.